Emancipatory Future Studies platform. Emancipatory Future Studies in the Anthropocene or a Heating World is a new knowledge project at our university. And it's really about trying to think through, if you like, subaltern views on the future in the context of looming and growing and unfolding climate chaos. It's really about connecting with emancipatory futures, perspectives in history, in the context of decolonizing pasts, in the context of utopia, dystopia, in the context of systemic pathways that are being built now for a different kind of future, as well as grand ecocentric futures, to really think about what's required, if you like, of a decarbonized world, post-carbon democracies, the deep just transition and its modalities, etc. Today's speaker is Manuel Newman, right? And Manuel is part of a very interesting group called the Local Power Research Group. And I think he's going to help us understand what the term means. And I suppose it speaks to their methodology and how they think about some of these problems. But he is anchored in the Department of Political Science at Kassel University. He holds a master's degree in globalization and development from SOAS, University of London. And previously he read political science at Delhi University and completed a bachelor's degree in international economics from Tübingen University. So we are very excited to welcome Manuel, who's going to be talking about renewable energy transitions in Africa. This is building on our previous talks. We had one on the fourth industrial revolution and its pitfalls, if you like. We had one on rural movements, building solidarity economy and food sovereignty pathways. Our last talk was on an urban movement trying to defend a food hotspot in the city of Cape Town, which is also, if you like, a major carbon absorber. And the defense of that commons, land, water, biodiversity, and cultural commons is very important. But today we're going to get a slightly different view on what states are doing in the African context around energy. So, over to you. Do you have one?
All right, cool. Thanks, Vish, for the warm welcome, and thank you guys for coming here and for your interest. My name is Manuel, and I'll be presenting the paper that our Local Power Research Group has been working on. And in terms of maturity, the paper, like, we hope to submit it soon to a public journal, to an academic journal. Hopefully it's going to be energy research and social sciences. The preliminary title, you can read it here, is Green and Pan-African Color, Analyzing African Renewable Energy Transitions. So what's the roadmap for today? What am I going to talk about? I'll briefly introduce our research group, and then we'll quickly delve into the paper. I'll talk about some general overarching trends of renewables on the African continent. We'll cover the theoretical framework. I'll quickly dive into the methodology that we deployed, and then we discuss the findings. And afterwards we'll have a discussion all together, and I'm looking forward to your inputs and hope to be able to incorporate them before we submit the paper in the end. All right. So, Global Power Research Group. Maybe up front, the wordplay. Like, global power is basically a wordplay of global and local. It looks at the interplay of like global dynamics and how they manifest locally. We are currently 6 members that work in varying roles and varying capacities for the research group. So we have 3 PhD students, and then 2 postdocs and 1 admin. We're part of the Political Science Department at Kassel University and funded by the Ministry of Education and Research. And the university also houses the ICDD, which is part of the Global Labour University, as is its things right here. Good. Diving into the paper, some overarching renewable energy trends on the African continent. Basically, for one, we've witnessed a massive increase in capacity, roughly double in the last 10 years. We've also seen, a transnational scramble for renewable alternatives, meaning that investments in Africa and the Middle East rose tenfold over the same period. But we've also seen that the process has been highly diverse and very uneven. And from an academic viewpoint, we realized that especially in the transition management debate, there's hardly any research being conducted in the Global South. So we basically tried to pursue two different goals with our paper. For one is to contribute to the transition debate with empirical data, and secondly to expand the theoretical debate around transition studies with more with a focus on just energy transitions and so. Okay. The major research question that guided our research, we had one overarching question, and that is, how do African states approach renewable energy transitions? And we had a few supplementary ones as to what are underpinning trends, what are the main drivers behind it, and and how do those transitions account for concerns around energy justice. Coming to the theoretical framework, we deployed a number of different concepts, and I just briefly want to touch upon them to make it slightly clearer. So we have one, socio-technical transitions, which were predominantly pioneered by the Dutch school, so Wiels among others, but also used by Mark Swilling and Anneke in Stellenbosch. And what socio-technical transitions basically mean is that renewable energy transitions are not merely technological, but also require innovation in institutional arrangements, ownership structures, production chains, occupational skills, logistics, public services, and not least consumer habits as well. So it's much broader than merely focusing on the technological aspect. Then secondly, Marquardt and Kern used this interesting term of purposive transitions, which we found very useful in our context, because I think an historical comparison is neat in this context, because previously most large-scale transitions, in the energy space, be that from wood to coal, or from coal to oil, were predominantly technologically driven, or at least were driven by profit margins that then opened up and that firms would exploit due to technological advancements. And the difference in the low carbon transition or green transition or renewable energy transition lies in the need to transform due to environmental externalities that have not been priced in as yet. So the initial impetus, and let me emphasize initial impetus, is much more state-driven rather than market-driven. Okay, next, just transition. We have a couple of people here in the room that know a lot more about just transition as I do, so I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. But maybe briefly, it speaks to the need to include environmental justice concerns, labor and employment aspects, as well as general awareness for the political economy in which transitions take place. And linked to that, the concept of energy justice. We featured two examples here. One, Silverpool and Dworkin, that developed an energy justice concept. They drew predominantly on liberal justice thinkers like Rawls and Sen and Fraser. And the one that is more suitable, that we found more suitable for our research, was developed by Jenkins and others, who suggested an analytical framework by distinguishing between distributional and procedural justice aspects. Okay. Quickly touching upon the critique of transition management before we go forward. For one, there is the critique of post-politics pioneered by Eric Svenfredo, who basically avers that transition management is too technical and fails to reflect the deep-rooted political qualities of transition processes. And that's, for example, is already emblematic in it being called management rather than governance, and democratizing qualities of transition processes are overlooked. Distribution of benefits, like for example, when it comes to energy or electricity access, are overlooked, and so is the burden sharing, like the pollution around it. And questions of legitimacy and representation, for example, who gets to decide where to build renewable energy stations and who participates in the process, are not sufficiently raised. Secondly, the just blind spot in transition management. We found very few exceptions when it comes to accounting for
just considerations, and one exception would be that I want to mention here is Boama and Rothfuss in 2018, who bring in distribution concerns, and they argue that the solar home systems in Ghana were purchased and used to counteract the perceived expense of electricity, and even more so to counteract the unreliability of grid-based electricity. And they used these solar home systems to quench their demand for electricity-intense lifestyles, which is why they termed them energy elite. And I guess similar tendencies are also prevalent in South Africa. Lastly, Sobercool and others detected a certain Eurocentrism in the set of norms that underpin most of transition management. And they tried to counterbalance that by drawing on other concepts and cosmovisions, like for example Ubuntu, but I guess those are the exception rather than the norm. Okay, so much so for the theoretical framework. Let's delve into the empirical part of the paper. Basically our sample, so we did a mapping of renewable energy policies, and basically our sample comprised of all African countries that have put in place some form of renewable energy legislation over the past 2 decades, resulting in us ultimately selecting 35 states. For each country, the renewable energy policies were summarized in terms of goals and content, and the actors were accounted for in the size and so forth. We combined this information with country-specific energy information like installed capacity, energy mix, energy access, and so forth. You can see the databases here on the right that we used, and also the indicators with which we track the different countries. This was then followed by deductive coding, according to 3 different dimensions: the processual, the actor-specific, and lastly a normative dimension. The processual dimension assesses, it's the most complicated one, it assesses the scope and scalability of a policy, for example its size and depth, and whether it's applied locally or globally, nationwide, sorry. We use the IRENA framework for this, and the IRENA framework uses direct, integrative, and enabling policies. Direct policies are material incentives like feed-in tariffs and the like. Integrated policies are investment regulations or infrastructure that is being provided. And enabling policies are the most far-reaching that are about funds providing cheap capital for renewable energy, or awareness-raising programs, or skills transfer programs and the like. The actors dimension identified the driving forces behind the policy, and the normative dimension assessed whether the policy mix reflected objectives of energy justice, both procedural and in redistributive aspects. Okay. Maybe, do you have any questions of understanding so far, or shall I move on?
Take things at the end.
All right. Okay, let's move on to our findings. This is a rather long slide, just bear with me. So in the majority of cases, we found state institutions to act as initial change agents that formulate action plans and set ambitious targets for the respective energy mixes. So we do see, Arkad and Kern's, purpose of transitions kind of mirrored in our findings. So we had several African states that started with the implementation of direct renewable energy policies during the late 1990s and early 2000s. And in many cases, these policies targeted specific areas, for example, import duty exemptions on renewable energy parts. Of course, examples would be Ghana in 1994, Senegal in 1998, Ethiopia in 2002, or Kenya in 2008. And other examples would be rural electrification programs using renewables, such as in Malawi as early as 1980, in Mali 1996, and Uganda in 2002. And we observed that there are a number of states that still almost entirely rely on direct policies. For instance, Botswana, Togo, Cameroon, or Gabon. So while we do observe this initial impetus by states to kickstart transition processes, in the medium term, many tend to more directly be shaped by a larger variety of public and private, domestic and transnational actors. So that direct policies often mark the initial point of departure, but then many states strive to depart from that framework, and we increasingly find states using integrated policy frameworks that combine these direct policies like feed-in tariffs or biofuel blending mandates with more integrated ones that have a more cross-cutting policy target of the target energy poverty as a part of a larger development initiative. Thirdly, and that's probably most interesting, at least in my view, we observe a general drive towards market-oriented tools, and South Africa would be a case in point for abolishing its feed-in tariff in favor of a tender program, REAP, that I'm going to speak about in a bit. Secondly, another instrument that found wide application is also used in the context of market-oriented tools is are so-called de-risking instruments, which foster investment by hedging or shifting risks that may adversely affect investors' decision-making. So, GetFit would be an example of such, which was pioneered by the KfW and implemented in Uganda and Zambia, and also envisioned to be implemented in Namibia, Malawi, and Mozambique, in which development banks effectively act as lenders of last resort, in case either the projects fail to service their respective debts, or the utility doesn't pay for the generation of renewable energy. So this observation, the turn towards market-based instruments feed into this broader tendency to initiate comprehensive policy frameworks which increasingly rely on market forces and set incentives for international investments. These policies usually combine a range of direct, integrated, and enabling instruments and are driven by the aim to create improved market conditions. Examples would be unbundling of monopolies, fostering market transparency, as well as competition among independent power producers. So currently comprehensive policy frameworks are in place in Algeria, Cape Verde, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Mauritius, Rwanda, South Africa, at least almost, Tanzania and Uganda. And then on the other hand, and referring to the last bit on this slide, there are still many states that do not have tangible renewable energy transition programs, and that is due to two overarching reasons, let's say. Either the political economy is too deeply entrenched in fossil-based energy generation, so the oil extractivist countries like Gabon, Nigeria, Sudan, and Angola would be examples here, or they do not have enough state capacity or lack donor attention to formulate and implement renewable energy strategies. And examples there would be Benin and Togo. And given that what we did is a relatively high-level study, obviously you need to kind of delve into the respective country context to test the reasons behind it. But I guess that's the reasoning that kind of jumped in our faces. Okay. Moving on to the actor constellations that we found. Excuse me. So we found an unlikely array of stakeholders to shape and influence energy transition processes. We were able to detect three different sets of observations. First, there are a few states that strategically draw on donor support to pursue their renewable energy agenda. These quote-unquote donor darlings outsource technical aspects of the transition to development organizations, but do retain a core legislative and executive role. And this setup, the crucial interests of donor agencies and government are aligned, so both tend to seek market-oriented transition as medium to long-term solutions. Examples there are Uganda and Rwanda. Then secondly, we observed several cases where some factions within the state would actively pursue renewable transition endeavors, but then would be met with fierce internal resistance. In the case of South Africa, I guess ESCOM is the example, as an energy sector being characterized by the presence of powerful energy monopolists, who then clings to his respective path-dependent energy technology and tries to prevent that from moving forward. And Zambia would be an example to a lesser extent, or to a lesser degree. And third, we detected a tendency amongst a few states to not vigorously claim transition agendas themselves, but rather leave that to partnering donor agencies to develop and implement. So these states would then kind of tap into green finance without declaring ownership of the respective projects. And Cape Verde, for example, heavily relies on advisory and financial support from African development funds, Portuguese aid, and the Luxembourg Development Aid Agency. So they would be driving these renewable energy policies, and the government basically take a backseat. And interestingly, the ownership of these projects would then be hidden behind very formal language, but when you dig deeper into the respective policies, you realize that there is a really inherent interest for the government to pursue it, at least not outwardly towards renewable energy. Okay. Third finding regarding energy justice. In general, we find, unfortunately, that energy justice still appears to be a weak spot. And I guess part of the explanation is that the energy development nexus is a space where different logics collide. And an example is the increasing openness of transnational investors may place investors' interest over developmental concerns, potentially resulting in distortions in terms of project allocation, employment, and distribution of benefits. And I guess to make it slightly more palpable, the South African REAP program would be a point in case here. It's a very interesting example of, are many of you aware of the REAP program in the room? Okay. So it's basically a tender process. Like it's the implementation of the integrated resource plan that kind of sets out the energy planning for the country. And the REAP program itself would be a tender program wherein renewable energy projects would be bidded for, and the one with the lowest energy generation cost would be allocated that respective project. And the developers also have to comply with certain local content requirements and local shareholding requirements. So the tender is expected to lower generation costs through this competitive bidding, and it certainly did that, and it's why it's been widely hailed as a success internationally. But unfortunately, these competitive generation costs have not really translated into cheaper tariffs for the end consumers. Rather, we have NERSA recently increasing tariffs by 15% for the next 3 years. And I guess one reason for that is that renewable energy isn't big enough in terms of the overall energy mix to really have an impact on forcing prices down. So that's, I guess, one of the reasons. But then also the REAP program in terms of promises of job creation. Job creation itself has been stunted due to policy uncertainty around the REAP program, where it was halted for a couple of years. And because of that program sitting idle for a while, lots of manufacturing closed down. So if you are the developers kind of trying to build a manufacturing industry in the country, and then there's no further bidding around to allocate your industry, then I guess many developers were forced to close down. And during my interviews, I talked to a developer, and he referred to a couple of colleagues that invested millions of rands and had to then close down shop in the last couple of years. So overall, it hasn't yet really delivered on jobs. But there are lots of, let's say, arguments out there as to how to ameliorate that problem. To maybe briefly touch upon a positive example of procedural justice, Mauritius' long-term energy strategy is one such example, which has, it includes direct milestones. It includes, for example, the selling of 1 million solar lamps, showcasing the people's commitment there. But then furthermore, the strategy is also aware of energy as a justice-related and cross-cutting issue, which it tries to address through the integration of gender-sensitive energy policies, for example. So they do capacity-building programs which facilitate energy access for women, through be that microcredit systems or grassroots partnerships, if you like. And I guess another interesting example in the South African context would be the National Planning Commission's pathway to a just transition, where they travel the different provinces in the country and do stakeholder engagement. And I guess a few people in the audience also went to at least one such transition workshop there. Lastly, thirdly, the role of donors. I just picked that out because I couldn't cover all the different aspects in the paper because that would have been too much for this presentation. But I guess the role of donors is an interesting example because it's both a challenge and a chance in terms of procedural justice as well. Because in the case of strong donor alignment, combined with that lack of state interest, development banks tend to, as I said earlier, and other aid agencies as well, tend to express their interest in governing those renewable energy transitions through political and economic consultancy, introducing policy frameworks and funding lines. But I guess the question remains as to whether they then pursue the people's interest there or merely try to open up emerging markets for their respective industries to take off. And unfortunately, we weren't able, in the scope of this paper, to adequately address that question. So, in a nutshell, overall, as major takeaways of the paper, while several countries are progressing towards renewable transition at fast pace, others are stuck in a non-renewable or fossil-based pathway. But the ones that are quickly progressing towards greener futures tend to show stronger alignment of interest and feature more complex policy mixes, which then in many cases seek to leverage and increase private sector engagement. Then secondly, transition endeavors were driven by diverse stakeholder arrangements, different levels of engagement and collaboration between the state, the donor community, civil society, and markets, and each of these result in very distinctive forms of transition. I think that's fairly obvious. And then lastly, while especially auction mechanisms and auction instruments quickly drove down prices and enhanced the cleaner energy capacity of many states, careful attention remains to be paid to their effects on participation, accessibility, and ownership, which are the core components of energy justice. So where does that leave us in terms of going forward? I guess our analysis, being that kind of broad empirical analysis, leaves apt scope for research to reach out to those groups that are most palpably affected and thoroughly marginalized in these transition processes, in order to shed light on a couple of questions, and these are just as a suggestion. For example, what forms of governance, patterns of exclusion and inclusion can be detected in the various forms of stakeholder engagement? How prominent do civil society groups feature in these transitions? And more generally, what positive effects and ramifications does each trend yield in the respective country context? So we do see a need for in-depth case studies to kind of promote these issues further. And I guess I'm left in concluding that we, as a global power research team, conclude that transition studies has so far only selectively engaged with questions of justice and the political realities of green transitions. So we do observe the need to intensify intellectual engagement between transition studies, the political economy of energy, energy justice, concerns of post-colonial perspectives, to then ultimately arrive at more inclusive transition theories. And I think with that, that's it.
So we normally open it up for discussion, clarifications, questions, and so on. So let's do that.